The rain hadn't stopped since morning, and the diner on the corner of 5th and Miller was nearly empty. Behind the counter, a young waitress named Claire wiped down the same spot for the third time, watching the door, watching the clock, watching nothing at all. That's when the door creaked open and an old man stepped in, soaked to the bone, his coat torn at the shoulder, his shoes held together with tape. He didn't sit. He just stood near the entrance like he was waiting to be told to leave. Claire didn't wait for anyone to tell her anything. She grabbed a clean plate, walked to the kitchen window, and quietly asked the cook for the day's leftover soup and a piece of bread. She carried it to the small booth by the window and set it down gently in front of the old man. "It's on the house," she whispered. "Sit as long as you need, it's cold out there." The old man looked up at her, his eyes tired but sharp, studying her face like he was trying to remember something. "Thank you," he said softly. "You didn't have to do that." "Everybody's gotta eat," Claire said and turned to walk away. She didn't know that behind the kitchen door, her manager, a sharp-suited man named Roland, was already watching. And Roland did not like what he saw. He stormed out from the back, his face tight with irritation. "Claire, a word now." She followed him to the small office at the back of the diner, her heart already sinking. "You gave away food," Roland said, arms crossed. "Free food to a homeless man. Do you have any idea what that does to our numbers?" "It was just soup and bread," Claire said. He was freezing. Roland, he hadn't eaten. "That's not your call to make," Roland snapped. "This isn't a charity, this is a business. We don't feed people who can't pay." "That's not compassion, Claire, that's bad management, and frankly, it's theft." Claire's mouth fell open. Theft? It was leftover soup that was going in the trash tonight anyway. "I don't care," Roland said, his voice rising, cold and final. "You've been warned about this before, feeding strays, giving out free coffee, comping meals for anyone with a sad story. This is the last time, clock out, you're done here." The words hit her like a slap. "You're firing me. For giving an old man soup." "I'm firing you," Roland said, "for making decisions that aren't yours to make. Turn in your apron." Claire stood there for a long moment, stunned, humiliated, the sound of the rain suddenly very loud against the window. She didn't argue anymore. She untied her apron with shaking hands, folded it neatly, and set it on his desk. "I hope that soup was worth it," Roland said as she walked out, not even bothering to look up from his paperwork. That last line would echo in his mind far longer than he ever expected. Claire walked back through the dining room, eyes down, cheeks burning with humiliation. A few regular customers had heard the shouting. They looked away, awkward, unsure what to say. The old man in the booth, however, did not look away. He watched her walk past, her jaw tight, holding back tears, and he set down his spoon. "Miss," he called out gently. "Wait." Claire paused, forcing a small, tired smile. "It's okay," she said. "Really enjoy your soup." "You lost your job because of me," the old man said, standing slowly, wincing at some old ache in his knees. "That's not okay." "It's not your fault," Claire said. "It's fine, I'll figure it out." She pushed through the door and out into the rain before he could say anything else, disappearing into the gray evening, leaving behind an empty booth, a bowl of soup gone cold, and a manager who thought the matter was already closed. He had no idea it had only just begun. The old man's name, though no one in that diner had ever bothered to ask, was Walter Hayes, and Walter Hayes was not in fact a homeless man. Walter had once been. Decades ago, as a young man fresh off a factory layoff, he had spent 2 winters sleeping in shelters, in stairwells, in the backs of buses that never stopped moving so the drivers wouldn't have to kick him out into the cold. He remembered what it felt like to be looked at like a stain on the floor. He remembered the one woman, a diner waitress much like Claire, who had once slipped him a sandwich wrapped in a napkin and told him, "Nobody deserves to go hungry, sweetheart. Not on my watch." That single act of kindness, he always said, had saved more than his stomach that night. It had saved his belief that the world still had good people in it. Years later, after a long, unlikely journey through night classes, small investments, a business that failed and then one that didn't, Walter Hayes became the quiet, private owner of a hospitality investment group, one that, among other things, had spent the last 2 years in negotiations to acquire a small but growing diner chain. The very chain that owned the diner on 5th and Miller. He had come that evening not as a customer but as an observer. It was something he still did occasionally, decades into his success, dressing down, walking into one of the businesses tied to his investments, unannounced, unrecognized, just to see how people were really treated when no one thought anyone important was watching. He had seen a lot of things over the years, rude waitstaff, indifferent managers, but he had rarely seen someone risk her own job for a stranger without hesitation, without needing to be thanked. Walter sat back down at the booth for a long moment after Claire left, staring at the door she'd walked through. Then he took out his phone and made a single call. "Get me everything on this location," he said quietly. "And find out who that young woman is, the one who just got fired." The next morning, the diner opened as usual. Roland arrived early, feeling rather proud of himself. He'd handled a problem employee, restored order, made an example. He straightened his tie in the reflection of the front window and unlocked the door, ready for another ordinary day. It was not going to be an ordinary day. At exactly 9 o'clock, a black car pulled up outside. Two people stepped out first, a woman in a sharp gray suit carrying a leather folder and a younger man with a tablet. Then from the back seat stepped Walter Hayes. Only this time he wasn't wearing a torn coat. He wore a simple, well-tailored overcoat, his silver hair combed neatly back, his presence entirely different and yet unmistakably the same man. Roland blinked at him from behind the counter, confused. "Can I help you?" "Yes," Walter said calmly, stepping inside. "You can gather your staff, all of them. I have an announcement to make." Roland's confusion turned to irritation, the kind reserved for a man used to being the most important person in any room. "I'm sorry, sir, who exactly are you?" The woman in the gray suit stepped forward and set the leather folder on the counter, opening it to a page with a company letterhead Roland recognized immediately, the parent group that owned this diner and 11 others like it. "This is Mr. Walter Hayes," she said, "majority owner of Hayes Hospitality Group, which, as of 6 o'clock this morning, completed its acquisition of this location and every other property under Millbrook Diners, Inc." The blood drained from Roland's face. "I believe you two have already met," Walter said, folding his hands calmly in front of him. "Last night, you called it theft, if I recall." Roland's mouth opened, but no sound came out. "Sit down, Roland," Walter said, not unkindly but with a weight that left no room for argument. "Let's talk about the soup." The remaining staff gathered slowly, wide-eyed, whispering among themselves as they realized exactly who was standing in their diner. Walter waited until everyone was present before he spoke again, his voice calm but carrying easily through the quiet room. "Yesterday I sat in that booth by the window," he said, pointing. "I was cold, I was hungry. And a young woman who works here saw a stranger who looked like he had nothing, and she gave him something anyway. Not because she had to, not because anyone asked her to, because it was the right thing to do." He looked directly at Roland now, "And you fired her for it." "Sir, company policy states," Roland stammered. "I know exactly what the policy says," Walter interrupted, his voice hardening just slightly. "I wrote a version of that policy myself 30 years ago in a company far smaller than this one. And nowhere in it, not then, not now, does it say we punish kindness." The room was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator behind the counter. "You saw an old man in torn shoes," Walter continued, "and you saw a liability, a number on a spreadsheet. What you didn't see, what you never even bothered to look for, was a person. That failure, Roland, isn't a small thing, that's the whole thing." Roland's face had gone pale, his earlier confidence entirely drained away. "Sir, if I had known who you were." "That's exactly the problem," Walter said quietly. "You shouldn't need to know who I am to treat me like a human being, nobody should." He let that sit in the room for a long moment. "Effective immediately, you're relieved of your position here," Walter said. "Not because you didn't know who I was, because of how you treated someone you believed had nothing to offer you. That tells me everything about how you treat every customer, every employee, every person who walks through that door believing they don't matter enough to be seen." Roland opened his mouth once more, but there was nothing left to say. He untied his own apron, in the same slow, humiliated silence Claire had the night before, and walked out the door he had once told her to leave through. Claire had spent the morning at her small kitchen table, a cup of coffee gone cold beside a stack of job applications she didn't yet have the heart to fill out. When the knock came at her apartment door, she wasn't expecting anyone. She opened it to find Walter Hayes standing there, this time with a warm smile and no rain in sight. "Mr." She started, recognizing him immediately, confused. "Walter," he said gently, "I believe I still owe you for the soup." Claire laughed despite herself, half in disbelief, stepping aside to let him in. He told her everything, who he really was, what the diner had become, what Roland had done, and what had happened to him that very morning. Claire sat frozen through most of it, her coffee forgotten. "I don't understand," she finally said. "Why does any of this matter to you? It was just soup." Walter shook his head slowly. "It was never just soup," he said. "A long time ago, I was the man in that booth for real, no money, no home, nowhere to be. And someone like you decided I still mattered anyway. I've spent 30 years trying to build something worthy of that kindness. Last night, I found it again in you." He reached into his coat and placed a folder on her table. "I'd like to offer you a position," he said. "Not as a waitress, as the general manager of that diner, and if you're willing, as someone who helps me choose managers for every location in this company going forward. People who understand what actually matters in this business, people like you." Claire stared at the folder, then up at him, tears gathering that she didn't bother hiding this time. "I just gave a stranger some soup," she whispered. "And that stranger," Walter said softly, "is never going to forget it." Weeks later, the diner reopened under new management, a small brass plaque added quietly by the door, "No one leaves hungry here, ever." Claire stood behind the counter, not as a waitress anymore, but as someone who now decided without apology who got fed and who got a second chance. It's easy to walk past the people the world has stopped looking at: the tired man in the corner booth, the woman folding her apron for the last time, the stranger nobody thinks is worth their time. But dignity was never about how much someone has. It was always about how we choose to see them. Sometimes, the person you overlook is the one who is quietly watching all along. And sometimes, the smallest kindness you'll ever offer is the one that changes everything. If this story moved you, don't just scroll past it, hit subscribe, because there are so many more stories like this one still waiting to be told. Stories about the people we underestimate and the quiet moments that end up mattering the most. See you in the next story. See you in the next story.